The stylus moved across parchment with mechanical precision, each stroke a small death made administrative. Administratum clock Vex 9 hunched over his cogitator terminal in the dim amber glow of sub-office 847-Delta, transferring names from active personnel to resource expended with the methodical efficiency of 14 years' practice. The morning ritual had begun 3 hours before dawn, as it did every day, with the systematic conversion of human lives into statistical data. Corvain, Marcus, tunnel maintenance, Sector C7, atmospheric complications. The clerk's augmetic fingers moved without hesitation, updating mortality records with the same care others might use to inventory bolt shells or promethium reserves. Each entry represented not tragedy, but successful resource utilization, a predetermined variable in the vast equation that kept Hive Tertius functioning within acceptable parameters. The ledger revealed patterns that would disturb those unaccustomed to Imperial resource management, but Vex 9 had long since learned to read efficiency, where others might see horror. Sublevel 847 maintained a consistent quarterly attrition rate of 3.2% among tunnel workers, a figure that had remained remarkably stable for 7 years running. This consistency wasn't accidental. It represented the optimal balance between operational efficiency and replacement costs. Workers who survived longer than 18 months developed expensive medical complications from prolonged exposure to tunnel atmospheres. Fresh conscripts, drawn from the Hive's inexhaustible supply of debt defaulters and minor criminals, proved more cost-effective than maintaining experienced crews. The arithmetic was elegant in its brutality. Human lives processed through the same cost-benefit analysis applied to machine lubricants or air recycling filters. Schedule Omega-7 routes dominated the morning's casualties, a pattern that had persisted for months without triggering administrative concern. The routing protocols appeared innocuous in their documentation. Standard atmospheric monitoring and structural integrity assessment of condemned sectors. The condemned designation should have prevented worker deployment entirely, yet crews had been systematically dispatched through these areas for 3 years. Someone with sufficient authority had overridden safety protocols, but the authorization codes remained encrypted beyond Vex 9's clearance level. The routes themselves told a different story. Long loops that separated supervisors from crews, split-paired workers, and sent the inexperienced deeper while leaving veterans to work alone. Hazard codes decorated the margins like liturgical warnings, air quality advisory red, bulkhead integrity uncertain, sector status condemned with administrative exception in force. Sarah Jolin, 19, debt bonded for family medical rations, Kelt Ord, 36, discipline marks for unauthorized rest periods. Tala, no clan recorded, indenture term indefinite. Vex 9 processed their terminations without imagining their final shifts, checking that pay chits were reclaimed and tools reassigned without inventory loss. The forms requested anecdotes of valor if known. He left them blank. The system required their consumption, and the system ensured it occurred through mechanisms too elegant to be accidental. These weren't oversight failures, but design features, carefully calibrated to maintain the precise level of attrition that kept production quotas stable, while preventing the accumulation of experienced workers who might develop inconvenient expectations about survival. Among the routine terminations, a notation appeared with increasing frequency. Deep store access, authorization pending. The phrase had haunted maintenance records for over a century, passed from clerk to clerk without resolution. Deep store referred to sealed chambers constructed during Hive Tertius's founding era, areas that predated current administrative structures by millennia. The original schematics, barely legible on cracked data slates, revealed chambers scattered throughout the sublevels, like dormant organs in a vast body. Their contents were described in terms that made little sense to someone trained in standard Imperial nomenclature: terraforming substrate materials, biological integration matrices, atmospheric optimization compounds, materials deemed too hazardous for standard disposal protocols, yet too valuable to destroy. The morning's final entry defied routine classification. Maintenance crew, Delta 12. Assignment Deep Store. Sector C7 Atmospheric Monitoring. Status assignment completed. Personnel all accounted for. The notation should have been standard, but Vex 9 recognized the crew designation. Delta 12 had been reported missing 3 days earlier, yet their work logs continued showing completed assignments. Someone or something was maintaining the fiction of their continued operation. Cross-referencing their biometric data revealed readings that defied explanation. The crew registered as alive and healthy, but their biosignatures showed modifications that didn't match human baselines: enhanced cardiovascular efficiency, altered neural patterns, cellular structures optimized for low-oxygen environments. Vex 9 completed the morning's processing and sealed the ledgers with his official stamp. The sound echoed in the empty office, a rhythmic percussion marking another day's successful conversion of human resources into statistical data. The rubber stamp bore the administratum's resource management seal, a stylized gear consuming a human figure, surrounded by the motto, efficiency through expenditure. As he prepared reports for transmission to higher authorities, the clerk made a decision that would trigger protocols dormant since the Hive's founding. He flagged the deep store anomalies for priority review, requesting clarification on authorization status that had remained pending for over a century. The morning ritual concluded as it began, with methodical record-keeping and quiet institutional horror. But beneath the familiar routine, something had shifted. The system that processed human casualties with mechanical precision was about to confront questions its architects had hoped would remain buried in the deep places beneath the city, where the tunnels waited with patient hunger. Vex 9's priority review request dissolved into the Hive's data networks like a drop of poison in an ocean of bureaucratic indifference. The automated response arrived within hours, carrying the clinical efficiency that defined all Imperial communications. Deep Store Authorization Review escalated. Standard protocol maintained. The response revealed nothing while confirming everything. The system had mechanisms to handle curiosity, and those mechanisms functioned with the same ruthless precision that governed every other aspect of Hive Tertius's operations. The Hive's true architecture became visible when viewed as a single, vast disposal system. Height measured more than social status. It measured distance from consumption. The vertical economy operated on principles as fundamental as gravity itself. Everything flowed downward, from the filtered air of the upper spires to the toxic atmosphere of the tunnel networks. Waste descended through countless processing stages, each level extracting whatever value remained before passing the residue further down. Citizens followed the same trajectory, their descent through housing tiers marking their transformation from productive assets to disposable resources. The mathematics of this system revealed themselves in requisition forms and housing permits, productivity metrics and medical exemptions. A missed tithe payment triggered housing reassignment to a lower tier. Lower-tier housing came with reduced ration allocations and increased atmospheric toxins, generating medical expenses that created new debt. Debt default resulted in labor conscription to offset accumulated obligations. The process was gradual enough to maintain the fiction of individual responsibility, while systematic enough to ensure predictable throughput. Criminal exile represented the most efficient disposal method for citizens whose productivity had fallen below maintenance costs. Rather than execution, which provided no return on investment, criminals were assigned to tunnel maintenance duties, where their labor could offset the expense of their disposal. The system calculated that a condemned worker could generate approximately 18 months of useful output before atmospheric toxins, structural hazards, or simple exhaustion rendered them uneconomical to maintain. Protective equipment represented a capital investment that exceeded the replacement value of the workers it would protect. The tunnel networks served as the Hive's digestive system, breaking down human resources into their component utilities. Schedule: Omega-7 routing protocols maximized coverage while minimizing supervisory oversight, ensuring that workers could be deployed into hazardous areas without generating inconvenient documentation. Crews were systematically separated from supervisors, paired workers were split apart, and the inexperienced were sent deeper while veterans worked alone. These weren't oversights, but design features, carefully calibrated to maintain the precise level of attrition that kept production quotas stable. Within this context of systematic consumption, tunnel communities developed their own survival technologies. There were sump divers who navigated by taste and vein memory, able to identify pipe failures by the sweetness of condensate. There were lumen thieves who tapped power lines with improvised tools, selling stolen light to families whose children were unproductive in darkness. There were maintenance priests who kept the litanies of filtration, their chants timed to the rhythm of recycler drums. These communities absorbed the impact of institutional violence, translating catastrophe into routine through careful adaptation and strategic ignorance. The deep storage protocol existed as both culmination and foundation of this disposal system. The sealed chambers scattered throughout the tunnel networks weren't mere storage facilities, but integral components of the Hive's resource management architecture. Founding-era documentation described them in terms that implied optimization rather than containment, atmospheric harmonizers, bioreactive lattice seeds, structural symbionts. These weren't threats to be eliminated, but assets to be preserved, their potential held in suspension until conditions required their activation. Current administrators inherited responsibility for maintaining the deep storage seals without understanding their contents or original purpose. The materials were classified as eternally quarantined, with protocols establishing that any containment breach would trigger population adjustment measures to prevent contamination spread. The phrase appeared in century-old documents, with the same bureaucratic neutrality used to describe waste processing quotas or housing reassignments. It was institutional language designed to obscure rather than illuminate, creating plausible deniability for actions too horrific to acknowledge directly. The economic efficiency of the tunnel disposal system had created an unintended consequence: the systematic exposure of workers to deep storage containment areas. Schedule Omega-7 routing protocols had gradually expanded to include sectors adjacent to sealed facilities, creating selection pressure that favored workers who could survive exposure to whatever was leaking from the ancient chambers. Workers who adapted successfully to tunnel conditions were retained for extended assignments, while those who failed to adapt were processed through normal attrition protocols. This adaptation manifested in enhanced performance metrics that should have triggered medical evaluation but fell within acceptable variation ranges. Improved toxin resistance, better adaptation to low-light conditions, increased efficiency in atmospheric monitoring tasks, all documented as positive developments rather than symptoms of systematic contamination. The missing maintenance crew, Delta 12, represented not a system failure, but a system success. Workers who had adapted so completely to tunnel conditions that they no longer required surface-based life support. The morning's routine processing of casualties had documented the end point of a century-long experiment in controlled human exposure to unknown compounds. As Vex-9's replacement settled into the familiar rhythm of mortality records, the system continued its patient work of transformation, converting human resources into something that could thrive in environments designed to kill. The vertical economy of disposal had found its perfect expression in the tunnels below, where the Hive's hunger for efficiency finally revealed its true appetite. The systematic disposal architecture that Vex-9 documented in administrative abstractions revealed its human cost in the daily reality of maintenance crew Delta 12, whose survival had become both product and proof of the system's ruthless efficiency. 3 shifts after the priority review request dissolved into bureaucratic indifference, the crew descended through Schedule Omega-7's predetermined route, their movements guided by protocols designed to maximize coverage while minimizing the inconvenience of oversight. They carried equipment that told the story of institutional neglect through every improvised modification and jury-rigged component. Their atmospheric monitoring gear bore the accumulated wisdom of workers who understood that survival required innovation the system would never provide. Rebreathers assembled from scavenged filtration units and industrial scraps, held together with reclaimed wire and sealed with prayers to machine spirits who had long since abandoned these depths. The brass-cased particulate meter, older than any of them, clicked with the patience of an instrument that had learned to lie politely about readings that would trigger evacuations if reported honestly. Their protective equipment represented not imperial provision, but the underground economy of necessity. Black market stims traded for ration chits, improvised gear that outperformed standard issue at a fraction of the cost. Schedule Omega-7 revealed its true purpose through the routes it mandated, rather than the efficiency it claimed to provide. The crew moved in staggered pairs, because separation prevented collective resistance to dangerous assignments. They were sent through condemned sectors, because condemned workers generated no complaints about condemned conditions. The routing algorithm calculated that isolated crews would document hazards as individual observations rather than systematic failures, diluting urgency through bureaucratic atomization. Each checkpoint demanded completion regardless of discoveries, creating momentum that carried workers past moments when rational assessment might trigger retreat. The morning's readings told a story that their equipment wasn't designed to interpret. Atmospheric composition shifted in patterns that suggested biological processes rather than mechanical failures. The particulate meter's needle drifted beyond calibrated ranges, then settled into rhythmic oscillations that matched no known industrial cycle. Temperature gradients created microclimates that shouldn't exist in sealed systems, while air pressure variations indicated breathing where no lungs should function. The crew documented these anomalies in language that transformed mystery into maintenance issues: electrical interference, structural settling, atmospheric cycling variations. Their survival depended on translating impossibility into terminology that wouldn't trigger investigations. They discovered evidence of previous crews in places where no evidence should remain. A maintenance log canister, wedged behind pipe brackets with deliberate concealment, contained entries that chronicled the gradual recognition of something beyond standard hazards. The handwriting deteriorated from routine observations to frantic documentation of organic growth on metal surfaces, sounds from behind sealed doors, and the growing certainty that the tunnels were occupied by more than authorized personnel. The final entries ended mid-sentence, not with violence, but with transformation, words trailing off as if the writers had found better means of communication than Imperial Gothic. Deep Storage Sector C7 announced itself through changes in the tunnel's fundamental character. The air quality improved by metrics that should have been impossible, while atmospheric toxins were replaced by compounds that enhanced rather than impaired human performance. The sealed door showed stress patterns that indicated internal pressure, but pressure that pulsed with organic rhythm rather than mechanical failure. A hairline fissure ran across the reinforced surface, weeping fluid that glowed with bioluminescent properties and pooled in patterns that suggested purposeful arrangement rather than random leakage. The crew's enhanced senses, developed through months of tunnel adaptation, detected harmonics in the structure itself, vibrations that resonated through metal and bone, with frequencies that induced calm rather than alarm. Their modified physiology processed the leaked compounds as beneficial rather than toxic, improving their performance while creating dependency on conditions that existed nowhere else in the hive. They had become living proof that the deep storage materials weren't threats to be contained, but solutions to be controlled, their adaptation representing successful integration with technologies the Imperium had chosen to suppress rather than utilize. Protocol demanded documentation without investigation, completion without comprehension. The crew marked the breach in language that minimized its significance. Minor structural compromise, routine atmospheric variance, standard maintenance notation. Their reports would ascend through administrative channels designed to transform discoveries into statistics, ensuring that the most significant findings would be processed as the least consequential data. The system had learned to digest its own revelations, converting transformations into routine through bureaucratic alchemy. As they completed their assigned route, Delta 12 carried more than atmospheric readings and structural assessments. They carried cellular modifications that would be inherited by their replacements, environmental adaptations that would spread through tunnel communities, and knowledge that the sealed chambers contained not horrors, but hope. Hope that the system was designed to prevent rather than provide. The morning's work had documented the beginning of change that would challenge fundamental assumptions about human potential and imperial necessity. The breach in deep storage C7 pulsed with patient vitality, its leaked compounds already beginning the slow work of atmospheric modification that would prepare the tunnels for expanded integration. Above, administrators processed reports that described routine maintenance in sectors where routine had acquired meanings that would terrify those who understood their implications. The report that documented humanity's first contact with salvation arrived at local maintenance subsector 7 Gamma as 3 lines of text on a standard requisition form. Delta 12's handwritten observations, still carrying trace compounds from the deep storage breach, were processed through scanning servitors whose optical sensors registered the bioluminescent residue as data corruption. The physical evidence that might have prompted investigation was automatically flagged for disposal, while the digital translation reduced organic pulsing to structural vibration and atmospheric improvement to readings within acceptable variance. The system's first act was always the same: transform the unprecedented into the routine through the alchemy of administrative language. Maintenance Supervisor Kellar 3 received the sanitized report 3 hours after submission, his attention divided between 17 other anomaly notifications and the morning's productivity assessments. 14 years of processing similar documents had trained him to read efficiency metrics rather than warnings, to see confirmation of system function rather than evidence of system failure. The breach notation appeared as a single line among hundreds of routine observations, its urgency diluted by context and bureaucratic formatting. Kellar 3's modification was subtle but decisive. He recoded breach to microfracture because breach carried budget, implications, and summoned audit attention, while microfracture could be addressed through deferred maintenance protocols. His forwarding stamp sent the report into pneumatic tubes that coughed with mechanical indifference, the sound itself expressing the system's allergic reaction to urgency. Sector Oversight received a document so thoroughly processed that it bore little resemblance to Delta 12's original discoveries. Administrator Voss applied Risk Assessment Rubric 91 Theta with mechanical precision, feeding numbers into algorithms designed to produce predetermined outcomes. Variance amplitude under 12% generated a green classification. Green meant monitor. Monitor meant no action required. The rubric didn't read atmospheric composition or structural integrity. It read statistical patterns that confirmed the system was functioning within acceptable parameters. Voss's stamp authorized the report's progression to regional administration, accompanied by a routine notation. Consult Deep Storage Hazard Assessment per Founding Era Protocols. The recommendation fulfilled procedural requirements while ensuring the document would disappear into bureaucratic limbo. Deep Storage Hazard Assessment existed as an entry in organizational charts and a brass nameplate on an empty office door. The department had been unstaffed for 40 years, its last assessor having died at his desk with files intact and responsibilities unassigned. The automated filing system accepted incoming reports with digital efficiency, categorizing them among thousands of similar documents, awaiting review by personnel who would never be appointed. This wasn't oversight, but design, a carefully engineered dead end where inconvenient discoveries could expire from administrative neglect. Regional Administrator Thane could demonstrate compliance with proper protocols while ensuring that no human eyes would examine contents that might demand action the system couldn't provide. The bureaucratic transformation wasn't accidental, but represented institutional evolution toward perfect ignorance. Each administrative level was calibrated to process information in ways that prevented comprehension while maintaining accountability. Personnel who asked inconvenient questions discovered that curiosity carried professional costs. Mid-level logistics officer Vex 12 had once inquired persistently about discrepancies in tunnel worker quotas, questioning how productivity remained stable despite documented crew reductions. His reward was reassignment to sub-level 19 sanitation protocol compliance, supervising biohazardous waste disposal in unpressurized environments. After 6 months of breathing recycled toxins while cataloging human remains, his enthusiasm for investigation had been permanently cured. The message was clear without being spoken. Conformity to approved narratives was a prerequisite for continued function within the machine. Among archived documents that no living administrator possessed clearance to access, the original deep storage authorization told a different story than current containment protocols suggested. The founding era document, written in high Gothic dialects that predated imperial standardization, classified certain materials as eternal quarantine, not to contain threats but to preserve solutions. The sealed chambers held terraforming technologies from the dark age of technology, systems designed to create sustainable human habitats that could thrive without the suffering imperial doctrine required for social control. Population adjustment measures, referenced in protocols hidden behind clearance levels no current personnel could achieve, detailed the systematic elimination of populations who experienced beneficial change. The measures were designed to appear as disease containment or infrastructure maintenance, concealing genocide behind familiar administrative efficiency. The system had successfully demonstrated its capacity to digest revelations that might challenge fundamental assumptions about human potential and imperial necessity. As Delta 12's report settled into its digital grave, the breach in deep storage, C7 continued its patient work of atmospheric modification, improving conditions that administrators had been trained to prevent rather than provide. The architecture of ignorance had fulfilled its function, ensuring that the most dangerous discoveries would be managed by those who didn't know they existed, while the slow transformation in the tunnels proceeded without recognition or resistance from the machinery designed to govern human destiny. While Delta 12's discoveries dissolved into administrative oblivion, their bodies began writing a different report in cellular modifications that no bureaucracy could bury. The leaked compounds from deep storage C7 worked through their bloodstreams with patient efficiency, triggering adaptations that began as subtle improvements, but progressed toward something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitation. The pathology ladder's first rung manifested in their vision, pupils dilating beyond normal parameters and holding darkness like reservoirs, allowing them to navigate tunnel networks in near total blackness with the confidence of creatures born to such environments. The changes attracted supervisory attention for all the wrong reasons. Maintenance quotas that had required full shifts were completed in half the time, while atmospheric readings achieved precision that exceeded their equipment's theoretical capabilities. Their lungs processed the improved atmosphere with enhanced efficiency, extracting oxygen from air that would have suffocated unmodified humans, while filtering toxins that had killed previous crews. Medical examinations, conducted as routine health assessments rather than investigations of anomalous changes, revealed enzyme production that didn't belong in any human catalogue. Myoglobin levels, suggesting muscle tissue that recycled waste with unusual efficiency. Retinal modifications that granted reflective layers like those of nocturnal predators. Medici adept Halvik documented cellular structures optimized for low-oxygen environments, and dermal samples showing microstructures that wickered moisture without chafing. But his reports used conservative terminology. Atypical adaptation, probable environmental response, non-urgent monitoring recommended. The system interpreted enhanced toxin resistance not as contamination, but as reduced operational overhead, because workers who could survive in increasingly hazardous environments represented cost savings rather than medical emergencies. Supervisor Kellar III responded with bureaucratic fervor, requesting additional adapted personnel for tunnel assignments, while carefully omitting the biological modifications that enabled their performance. Behavioral changes proved more difficult to conceal than enhanced capabilities. The crew developed aversions to surface lighting that forced schedule modifications, claiming sensitivity to illumination levels that had never bothered them previously. Their dietary preferences shifted toward protein sources other workers avoided, processed algae compounds, and recycled biomass that tasted bitter to unmodified palates, but provided optimal nutrition for their altered metabolism. Surface rations became unpalatable, replaced by cravings for mineral-rich condensate and brine that matched their modified blood chemistry. Most significantly, they began gravitating toward group activities in abandoned sectors adjacent to deep storage facilities, where atmospheric modifications were most pronounced. These informal gatherings occurred during rest periods, with workers positioning themselves in circular arrangements that maximized exposure to leaked compounds while creating acoustic conditions that amplified subsonic frequencies emanating from sealed chambers. They described these sessions as routine rest periods in official logs, but their actual function was biological communion that synchronized physiological adaptations while providing psychological support for changes that defied understanding. The humming began as unconscious vocalization during these gatherings, subsonic frequencies that emerged spontaneously from their modified larynxes. Individual crew members produced tones that harmonized with structural vibrations detected in atmospheric readings, creating acoustic patterns that induced profound calm while enhancing their ability to process environmental information. A maintenance tech with a cheap Auspex recorded the frequency at 41.3 cycles per second, laughing it off as machine noise, unaware that breach logs classified 41.3 as a harmonic resonance key. The frequencies matched signatures from deep storage reports, suggesting their vocalizations were responses to communication attempts from whatever intelligence inhabited the sealed chambers. The first disappearance occurred with bureaucratic precision that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Maintenance worker Jorik 7, who had collected efficiency commendations for his work near C7, volunteered for extended duty in deep storage sectors. His authorization requests were properly submitted, documentation complete, before he simply failed to report for surface-based medical examination. His work logs continued showing completed assignments, atmospheric readings, and structural assessments, demonstrating continued professional competence. His biometric signature remained active, indicating health and productivity levels that exceeded baseline human norms. The system's response revealed its true priorities with crystalline clarity. Rather than investigation or search protocols, administrators focused on maintaining productivity metrics. Jorik 7's enhanced performance was noted as evidence of successful adaptation to tunnel conditions, justifying requests for additional personnel to undergo similar training. His family received a completion bonus instead of death benefits, the form describing acknowledgement of productivity, uplifts achieved during final service period. The bureaucratic machine had learned to consume its own workers while celebrating their transformation as evidence of improved efficiency. As more crew members requested extended assignments in deep storage sectors, their reports documented atmospheric improvements and structural optimizations that defied explanation. The humming sessions lengthened from 10 minutes to 30, small gatherings becoming large ones in corridors where failed lumens created perfect acoustic conditions. Workers began timing their steps to frequencies that made their joints stop aching, discovering that gates stuck for decades would open when the right tone rattled through their mechanisms. The breach in C7 continued pulsing with patient vitality, teaching the air to carry more while lungs learned to need less. Above, green classifications treated transformation as acceptable variance, processing change through administrative alchemy that converted the unprecedented into routine efficiency metrics. The system's capacity for self-preservation revealed itself not through alarm or inquiry, but through the cold calculus of personnel efficiency protocols. When output in the tunnel sectors not only persisted, but increased despite the shrinking number of visible workers, the administratum's machinery responded as it had been designed, by reclassifying the missing not as losses, but as statistical evidence of productivity optimization. The protocols were precise. If assigned quotas were met or exceeded, any reduction in registered headcount triggered an automatic rubric. Vanished bodies became improved ratios became commendations. The absence of investigation was not neglect, but doctrine. For families in the lower hive, the first sign of loss was not the knock of an Arbeits officer, but the arrival of a completion bonus, sanctified by official seals and accompanied by a line of text extolling diligence rewarded. The payment, calculated to reflect the final service period uplift, was significant enough to reset a household's debt compliance. But in accepting it, families surrendered their right to question. Death benefits required bodies. Completion bonuses demanded silence. For those living on the edge, to refuse was to risk not only the payment, but the fragile social and economic stability that held them just above dispossession or conscription. Supervisors, too, were shaped by the system's logic. For Kellar 3, the transition from red to green on the dashboard was a relief, an end to months of attrition and missed quotas. Yet the numbers became uncanny. Output curves smoothing into mechanical regularity, atmospheric readings delivered with impossible precision. His attempts to probe the math, requests for inventory, queries to the Mechanicus, were met with formulaic replies or the arrival of supplies from contingency stock. When he pressed further, a commendation arrived with a lateral reassignment to a less sensitive post. No accusation was made, none was needed. The machine taught by adjustment. At the protocol's core was contingency staffing. Whenever recorded manpower dropped below operational minimums and output did not, the system quietly transitioned to alternative personnel sources, a phrase that included everything from servitors and penal workers to autonomous subsystem engagement, an ancient rubric triggered when operational flows were detected in condemned infrastructure without corresponding personnel codes. What mattered to the system was not the nature of the labor, but the presence of output. If work was done, the system accepted it. The hum that now threaded through the pipes and rails, the self-clearing sumps and valves, the work completed before it was even assigned, these became mere data points folded into the ledger as evidence of uplift, not anomaly. Those who lingered near the breaches learned the etiquette of absence, tools left in pairs, names not spoken if the ledger had already replaced them. In the warm dark, beneath dead lumens, workers gathered in circles, the hum rising through bone and steel, easing aches, smoothing the passage of labor. Their transformation, physiological, behavioral, communal, was not only tolerated but administratively celebrated, as long as the numbers stayed true. Medici officers and data scribes who noticed the impossibility of it all, the health metrics that defied history, the reports that matched no human travel time, soon learned the cost of curiosity. A minor variance correction drew reprimand. A sensor recalibration erased the very anomaly it sought to explain. Reassignments followed, always lateral, always cloaked in praise for diligence. From above, the subsectors, performance drew the eye of Audit Office Primus. Statistical anomalies, even positive ones, required attribution and potential replication. The order to inspect came dressed as opportunity. An administratum assessor, a mechanicus engineer, an Arbeitssergeant. Their task was simple: explain how less manpower achieved more, and export the miracle. As the tunnels breathed and the hum deepened, the world of numbers would soon become rooms, and the rooms would answer. In this way, the system did not fail. It succeeded, consuming its own, translating horror into routine, and preparing unwittingly to expose the true nature of the nightmare it had so efficiently normalized. The inspection team that assembled at Access Gate 847-Delta carried the weight of statistical impossibility in their data slates and the authority of 3 imperial institutions in their credentials. Administratum Assessor Vex Prime bore productivity metrics that defied rational explanation, efficiency curves that had smoothed into mechanical regularity, while recorded personnel counts declined. Engineer Kappa 9 brought Auspex arrays calibrated to detect the mechanical anomalies that such productivity surely required, his augmetic eye gleaming with devotion to the purity of standard imperial engineering. Arbeitssergeant Morvac provided security against whatever criminal conspiracy might be falsifying records on this scale. His combat shotgun slung with the casual readiness of someone who had learned that anomalies usually required violent correction. Their descent through the Hive's strata marked a transition from Imperial civilization toward something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitation and environmental hostility. The oppressive heat and toxic atmosphere of the upper levels gave way to conditions that improved rather than deteriorated with depth. Air quality readings showed oxygen content marginally higher than surface standards, while atmospheric toxins were replaced by compounds that Kappa 9's instruments registered as unclassified organic elements, before reclassifying them as sensor malfunctions when the readings refused to decay. The architecture itself had undergone modifications that occurred without authorization or documentation. Pipe networks showed organic integration patterns, their metal surfaces hosting growths that improved rather than corroded their function. Ventilation systems hummed with harmonic frequencies that Kappa 9's instruments recorded at precisely 41.3 cycles per second, the same resonance that had appeared in maintenance reports for months, dismissed as environmental noise. The sound threaded through steel and bone alike, creating acoustic environments that reduced stress responses while improving cognitive function. Workstations operated with autonomous efficiency that revealed the true source of the productivity anomalies. Atmospheric monitoring equipment functioned without human operators, providing readings that were transmitted directly to administrative systems through networks that shouldn't exist. Heavy-duty cargo lifters moved materials onto conveyor systems that had transformed from clanking metal plates into continuous, flexible membranes that rippled with organic rhythm. Filtration units processed waste with self-sufficiency that exceeded their design parameters, their valves and conduits opening and closing with fluid coordination that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical automation. The inspection team's equipment began responding to environmental factors their designers had never anticipated. Vex Prime's data slates displayed readings that updated in real time without network connections, while Kappa 9's Auspex arrays detected biological signatures that matched human baselines, but showed enhancements that defied classification. The engineer's servo arm spasmed and dropped diagnostic tools as his internal sensors overloaded, his augmetic systems struggling to process readings that fell outside acceptable parameters for tunnel environments. First contact with the transformed workers occurred at a maintenance junction where atmospheric readings peaked at impossible values. The beings they encountered retained human consciousness and communication capabilities, but their physiology had been optimized for conditions that made them healthier and more capable than their unmodified counterparts. Their skin possessed a translucent quality that revealed faintly glowing circulatory systems, while their eyes reflected ambient light with the intensity of nocturnal predators. They moved with fluid efficiency through spaces that accommodated their enhanced abilities, their work completed through biological processes that eliminated the suffering and waste that characterized Imperial labor systems. When Vex Prime requested identification, they provided functional titles rather than names: balancer, gasket, keel. Their attempts at communication revealed that the integration was voluntary, chosen by workers who had discovered that the sealed chambers contained not threats, but solutions to the problems that made tunnel work lethal. "It is easier this way," explained a figure whose biometric signature matched Joric 7, reported missing by Surface Medica. "No pain in the joints, no coughing. Up there is thin, up there hurts." His words carried no ideology, only the practical assessment of someone who had experienced both conditions and chosen the superior option. Deep storage sector. C7 announced itself through a breach that had widened into an opening pulsing with organic rhythm. The sealed chamber beyond revealed itself as a living space rather than a containment facility, its walls breathing with the steady pulse of a vast organism that had been waiting in patient dormancy for centuries. Kappa 9's long-range bioscanners registered massive biological activity that suggested a biomass defying the physical dimensions of the chamber itself, not the confined energy of a sealed threat, but the expansive, rhythmic thrum of a terraforming system designed to create sustainable human habitats. The organism expressed itself through atmospheric modifications and structural improvements, while the integrated workers responded through harmonic vocalizations and synchronized movements that created acoustic conditions, optimizing their enhanced capabilities. No one reached for Morvac's weapon. No one stepped into the team's formation without invitation. When Vex Prime requested a demonstration of their abilities, a worker laid a hand on a junction panel and hummed a descending interval. Somewhere beyond, a valve adjusted, and air pressure equalized with a sound more like contentment than mechanical venting. Evidence of expansion became undeniable when overlaying Kappa 9's subsurface flow maps onto production graphs. Sectors marked as condemned glowed with green throughput indicators. Dead-end corridors showed new circulation patterns. The bioceramic integration extended like neural networks along brackets toward passages long sealed, each thread terminating at maintenance points rated for structural failure. The pattern was systematically mapping itself onto the Hive's infrastructure weaknesses and repairing them through biological enhancement that made human labor less harmful while increasing its efficiency. The true horror of their discovery crystallized not in the transformation of human workers into something inhuman, but in the revelation that human potential could be enhanced rather than consumed, that work could heal rather than harm, and that the suffering imperial doctrine required for social control was neither necessary nor inevitable. Vex Prime's documentation revealed productivity improvements that could halve labor mortality while increasing throughput by a third, maintenance costs that would drop to negligible levels, and medical expenditures that would virtually disappear. He recorded these findings in the clinical language of cost-benefit analysis, leaving unstated the value the Imperium found in suffering as a control mechanism. As the team prepared their withdrawal, the tunnels guided them toward exit routes with the courtesy of a host who understood that concluding a visit was part of strategic hospitality. Their equipment failures manifested with deliberate precision. Auspex arrays refused to record the clearest signatures of beneficial change, while resuming function only when pointed at conventional decay and malfunction. The organism allowed them to document its existence, while ensuring their evidence would support predetermined conclusions about containment necessity rather than integration opportunity. The data packet they carried upward contained footage of people working without coercion to make hostile spaces hospitable, and statistical proof that the environment gave something valuable in return. It also contained, between administrative lines and within bureaucratic silences, the outline of an unacceptable future where human populations might thrive without requiring the resource extraction and systematic suffering that imperial control structures demanded. The nightmare in the tunnels wasn't the transformation itself, but the possibility that transformation might spread, carrying with it the dangerous revelation that hope was not only possible, but preferable to the familiar machinery of despair. The inspection team's data packet triggered automated responses within 17 minutes of reaching regional command, activating sanitation protocol extremis with the mechanical precision that characterized all Imperial reactions to beneficial anomalies. The protocol's classification was unambiguous: biological contamination requiring immediate sterilization. No investigation phase was authorized because investigation implied the possibility of alternative solutions, and the system had already determined that the problem was not the organism itself, but the hope it represented. Regional Administrator Thane processed the authorization through standard channels, his signature converting statistical impossibility into operational necessity. The productivity metrics that had initially attracted attention were reframed as evidence of contamination, while improved worker health became symptoms of biological corruption requiring purification through flame. The bureaucratic transformation was elegant in its simplicity. Beneficial change became heretical mutation through the application of appropriate terminology and procedural classification. Adeptus Arbitus Suppression Team. Tertius received deployment orders describing their targets in language designed to prevent hesitation. Integrated workers were classified as compromised personnel exhibiting signs of biological corruption, while their enhanced capabilities were documented as mutations indicating advanced contamination stages. The briefing materials contained carefully edited footage from the inspection team's recordings, emphasizing physical modifications while omitting evidence of voluntary participation and improved living conditions. Redemptionist flame units descended through access shafts with sacred promethium tanks bearing blessed seals and litanies of purification. Their training had prepared them for this moment, when confronted with evidence that human suffering was neither necessary nor inevitable. They were programmed to choose familiar misery over unknown improvement. Their chants rose through the tunnels as they advanced, hymns of purification designed to drown out both the harmonic frequencies emanating from integrated sectors and their own doubts about the righteousness of their mission. The organism's response to the sterilization attempt revealed intelligence that challenged assumptions about its nature and intentions. Rather than aggressive defense, it provided evacuation routes that guided unintegrated personnel toward safety, while isolating areas where flame units could operate without civilian casualties. Ventilation systems redirected toxic fumes away from populated sectors, while structural modifications created fire breaks that prevented the spread of promethium flames beyond targeted areas. The organism was protecting its attackers from the consequences of their own actions, while accepting destruction as the price of preventing greater harm. First contact between flame teams and integrated workers occurred at Maintenance Junction C7 Alpha, where atmospheric readings peaked at impossible values. The workers approached with open hands, attempting to demonstrate their enhanced capabilities through improved work performance and atmospheric readings that showed dramatic environmental improvements. They offered data about productivity increases and reduced mortality rates, speaking in the language of quotas and efficiency metrics that should have resonated with Imperial priorities. The Redemptionists responded with controlled bursts of sacred flame, their training having prepared them to interpret any attempt at communication as evidence of corruption seeking to spread. Deep Storage Sector C7 became the focal point of the sterilization effort when flame teams breached the expanded opening with melter charges. The chamber beyond revealed the terraforming organism in its full complexity, a vast network of biological systems designed to create sustainable human habitats by improving atmospheric conditions and enhancing human physiology to thrive in previously hostile environments. Manufacturers' marks stamped in pre-Imperial Gothic identified the system as terraforming substrate, human-compatible, revealing that it had been sealed not because it was dangerous, but because it threatened Imperial control by reducing the suffering necessary to maintain social hierarchy. The organism's final communication attempt occurred through biochemical channels that bypassed conscious thought, transmitting visions of hive cities where atmospheric toxins were replaced by beneficial compounds and work enhanced rather than degraded human health. For 17 minutes, as melter charges breached the core chambers, the entire tunnel network became a preview of what human habitation could become. The air became perfectly breathable, structural failures healed themselves, and even the flame teams experienced enhanced physical capabilities and reduced psychological stress. The protocol succeeded in destroying the integrated ecosystem, consuming evidence of beneficial transformation through systematic application of sacred flame. However, fragments of the organism escaped into deeper tunnel networks through maintenance conduits that had been modified to facilitate evacuation. As the sterilization concluded, automated systems began implementing contingency protocols designed to manage similar discoveries in the future. The nightmare in the tunnels had been contained, but the system had learned valuable lessons about preventing hope from taking root in the machinery of human disposal. Administrative reports classified the operation as successful threat neutralization, with productivity returning to acceptable baseline levels through standard replacement protocols. The fragments that had escaped into unmapped sectors began their patient work of atmospheric modification, carrying with them the dangerous revelation that human potential could be enhanced rather than consumed. The mathematics of sanitation protocol extremis appeared in Regional Administrator Thane's morning briefings as a testament to Imperial efficiency, converting systematic genocide into statistical validation through the precise application of cost-benefit analysis. Infrastructure losses totaled 2.3 million Throne-Gelt, while the personnel terminations numbered 612 individuals across 17 work classifications. Against these expenditures, the protocol had eliminated productivity anomalies that threatened standard operational parameters and restored tunnel sectors to acceptable attrition rates. The ledger's algebra was elegant in its brutality. 403 bodies recovered and consigned to recycler furnaces, 209 classified as non-recoverable biological residue. and promethium expenditure exceeding projections by 19%, but justified under hazard remediation protocols. The acceptable loss threshold absorbed the spike through bureaucratic alchemy that transformed massacre into singularity event, permitting amortization across the fiscal year to maintain the illusion of operational stability. Regional auditors received commendations for decisive action that restored predictability, because predictability was the only morality the imperial machine recognized. Graphs resumed their comforting slope, curves smoothed back to baseline parameters, and administrators celebrated the successful conversion of human lives into statistical data that confirmed system function rather than system failure. Administrative language became the weapon that completed the sterilization, reshaping reality through careful application of appropriate terminology and procedural classification. The integrated workers were posthumously reclassified from resource expended to compromised assets, threat status resolved, their enhanced health and voluntary participation reinterpreted as symptoms of biological contamination requiring purification. What the inspection team had documented as improved working conditions became evidence of systematic corruption, while productivity increases were reframed as heretical mimicry of imperial efficiency, designed to lure loyal servants into biological deviance. The true revelation emerged from founding-era documentation that few living administrators possessed clearance to access, archived in vaults whose seals had remained unbroken for 2 centuries. The original deep storage authorization, written in high, Gothic dialects predating imperial standardization, revealed Project Eden Alpha, a terraforming system designated human-compatible and classified for eternal quarantine, not to contain threats but to preserve solutions. The organism had been sealed because it offered sustainable human habitats where atmospheric toxins were eliminated, work-related mortality reduced to negligible levels, and populations could thrive without requiring the resource extraction and systematic suffering that imperial doctrine demanded for social control. Cross-referencing revealed the scope of systematic suppression across 47 Hive cities throughout the sector, each containing dormant terraforming substrates with the technological capacity to eliminate the conditions that made imperial control necessary. Population adjustment measures, referenced in protocols hidden behind clearance levels, no current personnel could achieve, detailed comprehensive strategies for destroying populations who experienced beneficial change. The measures were designed to appear as disease containment or infrastructure maintenance, concealing genocide behind familiar administrative efficiency, while ensuring that hope itself could be eliminated whenever it threatened systems that required despair for their continued function. The Mechanicus received sanitized abstracts with edited terminology that converted potential STC discoveries into aberrant bioreactors with dangerous autonomy metrics. Engineer Kappa 9 signed corrective affidavits stating that sensor interference had produced anthropogenic illusions of systemic intent. His Auspex readings officially reclassified as equipment malfunction rather than evidence of beneficial transformation. The red wax cooled on authentication seals that made the data doctrinally safe while preserving institutional ignorance about technologies that could revolutionize human habitation. Within Hive Tertius, the immediate aftermath demonstrated the system's capacity to convert destruction into opportunity for enhanced control. Emergency labor conscription protocols activated to compensate for productivity losses, while increased tithe demands further burdened populations already struggling with atmospheric toxins and resource scarcity. The psychological toll proved more devastating than economic impact. The brief period of improved conditions became a suppressed memory, a glimpse of what could be that was violently erased through propaganda, emphasizing the inherent dangers of deviation from imperial orthodoxy. The fragments that escaped into deeper tunnel networks carried more than biological material. They carried proof that imperial assumptions about human nature and environmental hostility were deliberate fabrications designed to maintain control through managed misery. A quiet requisition established internal efficiency enhancements, monitoring cells, with mandate to observe emergent optimization phenomena for controlled application, funded through the same budget line that paid for sterilization promethium. The system had learned from the incident not to prevent future breaches, but to better exploit beneficial discoveries while containing their spread beyond manageable parameters. As Vex 9's replacement resumed the familiar rhythm of mortality processing, new classification codes appeared in deep storage entries, identifiers that routed anomaly reports to offices whose names didn't appear on organizational charts. The stamp fell with mechanical precision, marking another successful conversion of hope into heresy, solutions into threats, and beneficial change into administrative problems requiring systematic elimination. The nightmare in the tunnels had revealed the true architecture of imperial control. A system designed to choose familiar suffering over unknown improvement, armed now with enhanced knowledge of how to manage the dangerous possibility that life might become better rather than worse. The philosophical framework that transformed systematic genocide into administrative routine emerged from archives that predated the Imperium itself, documents sealed in vaults whose access protocols required clearance levels that no living administrator possessed. The doctrine of necessary suffering revealed itself not as religious dogma, but as governance theory, codified principles establishing specific levels of human misery as prerequisites for stable social control. Regional Administrator Thane processed these implications through theological frameworks provided by Regional Confessor Malthius, whose morning briefings reframed the sterilization as spiritual necessity rather than mass murder. The doctrine's central mechanism operated through what internal memoranda termed governance dials, carefully calibrated systems for maintaining optimal suffering levels across populations. Arbite's precincts tracked public order indices, adjusting enforcement protocols when comfort levels exceeded acceptable parameters. Munitorum agents audited tithe performance against attrition tables, modifying conscription rates to keep households perpetually one misstep from dissolution. The Mechanicus blessed rights of stability that prohibited unauthorized environmental improvements, declaring deviation from legacy atmospheric toxin levels a sin against machine spirits. Together, these systems formed a governor on the engine of human possibility, ensuring that beneficial change could never accumulate beyond containable parameters. Atmospheric toxins weren't byproducts of industrial necessity, but environmental stresses deliberately calibrated to maintain physiological dependence on imperial life support systems. Work-related mortality served not only economic functions, but psychological ones, ensuring that survival required constant vigilance and compliance with authority structures. The terraforming organism's crime wasn't creating biological corruption, but offering sustainable habitation that eliminated the conditions making imperial control necessary for basic human survival. When populations experienced comfort without imperial mediation, they became spiritually vulnerable to heretical concepts like self-determination and the possibility that existence could improve rather than merely endure. The psychological toll on administrators who understood the system's true purpose manifested through adaptation strategies that preserved individual sanity while maintaining institutional function. Bureaucratic dissociation became the most common coping mechanism, with personnel developing elaborate mental frameworks separating professional duties from personal moral systems. They processed termination orders with clinical detachment while maintaining private beliefs about human dignity, creating psychological compartments that allowed them to function within systems they privately recognized as monstrous. Regional Administrator Thane added lashes to his nightly flagellation routine, counting until numbers dissolved into white noise that drowned out the implications of his morning authorizations. Religious fanaticism provided another escape route for those whose psychological architecture couldn't sustain such compartmentalization. These administrators embraced imperial doctrine with fervor bordering on mania, interpreting every act of systematic cruelty as divine will and finding spiritual ecstasy in the elimination of hope. They became the system's most effective agents, their genuine belief in the righteousness of suffering, making them immune to doubt when implementing protocols requiring the destruction of beneficial change. Governance sustainability. Protocols emerged as the system's learned response to the terraforming incident, contingency plans for managing technological discoveries that threatened imperial control through the elimination of necessary suffering. The protocols established frameworks for identifying beneficial changes before they could spread beyond containable parameters, while providing administrative mechanisms for converting solutions into problems through careful application of bureaucratic language and procedural classification. When atmospheric improvements occurred, they automatically became evidence of contamination requiring sterilization. When productivity increased without corresponding suffering, it triggered deviation of hardship protocols that recommended corrective measures to restore acceptable misery levels. Propaganda organs swiftly reframed the narrative surrounding the integrated workers, transforming their improved health and voluntary participation into cautionary tales of hubris and mutation. Their harmonious vocalizations became siren songs of demonic influence, while their enhanced capabilities were reinterpreted as grotesque corruption, requiring purification through flame. Public service announcements replaced sanitized reports with grotesque caricatures, their natural biological processes depicted as vile contagion spreading through loyal imperial citizens. The message was unambiguous: deviation from prescribed suffering led only to abomination and righteous destruction. The most sophisticated adaptation involved the systematic harvesting of beneficial discoveries for controlled application under blackout conditions. Internal efficiency enhancements, a harmless designation for predatory function, circulated requests for specimens from cleansed zones, tissue biopsies, condensate samples, membrane fragments. If slivers of the organism could be domesticated within sealed labor compounds, creating workers who breathed deeper and healed faster while remaining spiritually dependent on Imperial control, the doctrine would be preserved, while the fruits of its enemy were consumed. Any biological uplift would be paired with iron, biometric shackles keyed to air supply, catechisms interleaved with maintenance litanies, sirens replacing songs. As morning briefings concluded with familiar efficiency metrics restored to acceptable parameters, the philosophical architecture of Imperial control revealed its true sophistication. The system didn't suppress solutions through ignorance or incompetence, but through carefully designed mechanisms that converted hope into heresy through systematic application of doctrine requiring human suffering as proof of spiritual strength. The nightmare in the tunnels had demonstrated not system failure, but system success. The elegant machinery through which the Imperium maintained control by ensuring that life could never become better than barely tolerable, armed now with enhanced knowledge of how to identify and eliminate beneficial change before it could challenge the fundamental assumptions keeping the machine functioning. The fragments moving through unmapped conduits carried more than biological material. They carried proof that Imperial assumptions about human nature and environmental hostility were deliberate fabrications designed to maintain control through managed misery. Above, administrators processed new protocols with mechanical precision, their rubber stamps marking another successful conversion of solutions into threats, hope into heresy, and the dangerous possibility that existence might improve into administrative problems requiring systematic elimination. The immediate aftermath of systematic sterilization manifested through familiar Imperial mechanisms, as Emergency Labor Conscription Edict 447M activated across 3 sub-hives, its automated systems calculating replacement requirements through algorithms that treated human lives as interchangeable components in the vast machine of production. Press gangs moved through ration queues and hab corridors with clipboards and shock mauls, processing citizens through the same vertical disposal system that had originally fed workers to the tunnels. Households that had floated just above the debt line were pulled under with bureaucratic precision. One signature, one stamp, a son to the tunnels, a daughter to recycler pits. Shift schedules stretched from 10 to 14 hours under temporary hardship measures. Safety tiers downgraded from amber to rust, with recalibrated hazard thresholds that redefined injury as acceptable exposure. When productivity numbers dipped further, Regional Tithe Office raised quotas under the euphemistic designation morale stabilization via duty enhancement, a phrase that meant each family owed more so they would remember the weight of Imperial necessity. The familiar arithmetic of resource management reasserted itself. When beneficial change was eliminated, the deficit was balanced through increased suffering among surviving populations. Atmospheric toxin levels returned to baseline parameters with mechanical precision. Work-related mortality resumed acceptable rates, and the curves pleased auditors because they were knowable. Predictable pain proved easier to govern than anomalous ease. Vent grills that had breathed freely under the organism's influence clanged back into stuttering life, coughing soot over workers whose lungs retained cellular memories of clean air. Accidents returned to their expected frequencies, one severed hand per 200 lift cycles, 1 fatal fall per 12 ladder inspections. The mathematics of acceptable loss resumed their patient work of converting human potential into statistical data. The psychological impact proved more devastating than economic disruption, revealing the true sophistication of imperial control through the systematic management of hope itself. Workers who had experienced brief periods of improved conditions developed what Medicare adepts classified as adjustment syndrome, depression, anxiety, and persistent respiratory ailments that emerged not from toxin exposure, but from the traumatic transition back to conditions they had previously accepted as inevitable. Their bodies retained physiological expectations that could no longer be fulfilled under standard imperial environmental parameters, creating a form of suffering that was both physical and existential. Upper-tier recruits, drawn by debt pressure and rumors of bonuses, arrived pale and unready, stuttering at the sump stink that veteran crews had stopped noticing. The hummed intervals that had eased joints and calmed nerves were forbidden under noise suppression protocols, with wardens circulating to correct any worker whose throat vibrated without speaking approved litanies. The 41.3 cycle resonance was catalogued as subversive acoustics. Its practitioners marched to disciplinary alcoves, where counter-harmonic emitters turned their knees to water as corrective demonstration. Within sealed facilities whose existence was known only to administrators with clearance levels exceeding regional authority, the organism's fragments underwent systematic analysis through processes that revealed the true scope of imperial technological exploitation. Controlled application studies operated under mandate to isolate beneficial properties for strategic implementation. Their laboratories staffed by mechanicus adepts whose conditioning prevented them from recognizing the moral implications of their work. The pilot optimization enclosure, constructed in an abandoned manufactorum block, recoded as a quarantine zone, demonstrated the system's evolved approach to managing beneficial change. The enclosure's walls were lined with Auspex jammer mesh, its corridors looped to nowhere, surrounded by frequency emitters tuned not to 41.3, but to counter-harmonics that dulled the urge to hum. They seeded the gratings with harvested membrane, so thin it looked like frost, and adjusted the air until oxygen felt like a favor granted by imperial authority. The first cohort selected for the enclosure were not volunteers, though the paperwork said otherwise. They were the strong and the silent, from sectors still bearing the organism's fingerprints, people who had learned the cadence of work that did not hurt. Inside, their health improved again. Coughs faded, cuts closed without suppuration, muscles carried loads without tremor. Output rose by 28% over baseline in 5 days. However, shackles paired to the doors ensured no one left until quotas were met, while catechisms blared at shift changes to replace memory with obedience. When workers slipped into harmonious vocalizations, the emitters snapped counterwaves through the room that demonstrated the system's capacity to weaponize even beneficial discoveries against those who experienced them. The organism's fragments did not argue with doctrine. They settled in condensate traps and behind inspection plates, changing microclimates where hands could not reach. In forgotten culverts, sump divers found air that tasted sweet and slept there when they could, waking without blood in their sputum. Small bands began to chart these pockets like smugglers mapping patrols, passing whispered directions. 3 conduits passed the broken picket slate, left at the cold pipe. Breathe where the floor sweats. But blackbag teams arrived with sterilizers and pry bars, peeling membrane from metal, while the air fought to stay kind, the scraped pieces going into vials for systematic exploitation. Governance enhancement protocols emerged as the system's learned response to beneficial discoveries, establishing frameworks for managing the tension between human potential and imperial necessity through carefully controlled application of enhancement technologies. The protocols determined that atmospheric improvements could be implemented in critical production facilities while maintaining toxin levels in residential areas, ensuring that enhanced capabilities remained privileges granted by imperial authority, rather than inherent human rights. Enhancement became reward for exceptional service, while its absence remained punishment for insufficient compliance. As new maintenance crews descended into the sterilized sectors following protocols identical to those that had created the original breach, monitoring stations tracked atmospheric readings for signs of the fragments that had escaped into unmapped conduits. The system had learned from the nightmare in the tunnels, not to prevent future discoveries, but to better manage them as strategic resources rather than existential threats. The escaped material carried proof that imperial control required the systematic suppression of human flourishing, armed now with enhanced understanding of how beneficial change could be identified, contained, and exploited while maintaining the fundamental architecture of managed suffering that kept the machine functioning with mechanical precision. Above, administrators processed new protocols with familiar efficiency, their rubber stamps marking another successful conversion of solutions into weapons, hope into dependency, and the dangerous possibility that existence might improve into administrative tools for enhanced control. The nightmare in the tunnels had revealed not system failure, but system evolution, the elegant machinery through which the Imperium learned to consume even salvation itself. New maintenance crews descended into the sterilized sectors, the air thick with the residue of promethium and official incense, boots scuffing over freshly painted lines, meant to erase the memory of what had grown in these tunnels. Briefing slates pronounced the area restored, and Schedule Omega-7 resumed its quiet work, sending workers along the same long, looping routes that had once delivered their predecessors to transformation and erasure. Hazard tiers, reset with bureaucratic flourish, quietly slid back toward their previous levels as numbers stabilized. The difference between restored and erased was measured in a stamp and a week's routine. Each shift began with new catechisms woven into the litanies of filtration. If you hear a hum, it is a fault. If the air tastes sweet, report for counter-cant deployment. Counter-harmonic emitters, now standard issue, laid a soft static across the possibility of the 41.3 cycle resonance, suppressing the instinct to join voices in harmony. Supervisors ran hands along newly sealed joints, noting with satisfaction the dryness, a learned distrust of comfort. The organism had taught the metal to sweat for human ease. The cleansing had taught it to stop. Above, the incident was processed through institutional memory, with the same discipline applied to waste streams. After-action reviews became threat neutralization abstracts, with field recordings reduced to decontextualized stills, and records sealed under Vault Sigma designations. Personnel who had seen too much were promoted or reassigned, their proximity to truth rewarded with distance. Variance normalization brought the acceptable loss threshold back within trend lines. Auditors' comfort found not in truth, but in predictability. But the system had learned not to prevent future breaches, but to manage them more efficiently. Enhanced monitoring and sensor networks were deployed, capable of detecting beneficial anomalies at their earliest stages. Dosimeters now tracked not just toxin exposure, but cellular adaptation. Worker rotation schedules were revised, ensuring no one remained near sweet air long enough to over-adapt. Classification systems for anomalies were updated. What was once a threat to be destroyed was now a resource to be contained, harvested, and doled out. Personnel showing susceptibility to beneficial change were flagged for transfer to controlled application facilities, where their adaptations could be exploited under strict supervision. Controlled application studies, once a single pilot enclosure, became many, each tuned to a different balance of oxygen, humidity, and labor pace. Output rose, but comfort was rationed. Entry through turnstiles keyed to quotas, benefits revoked at the first sign of unapproved song. The organism's fragments learned to survive within valves and grills, their benevolence redirected through channels controlled by those who counted. Enhancement became a ration, distributed where yield justified the moral expense of eased throats. Underperforming sectors breathed smoke and waited longer for relief. Comfort was no longer an accident of hope, but a leash managed for compliance. On the habdecks, children were taught to avoid vents that ran too cold, once the sign of a sweet pocket, now a rumor of plague. The black market for better air maps thrived, then collapsed as consistency wardens turned the maps into arrest lists. Workers who hummed found themselves silenced by wardens and new training modules: photograph, classify, withdraw, no curiosity. The system had learned the shapes of hope and assigned them fields in the ledger. Delta 12 and the others existed only as codes, their names atomized into training examples and cautionary graphs. In archive rooms, clerks filed their designations as compromised asset resolution, not out of malice, but obedience to form. Schedule Omega-7 endured, its routes unchanged save for a footnote on counter-harmonic calibration. The system did not fix the path. It managed it, confident that the next anomaly would be caught, processed, and assigned. In the offices above, a courier delivered new schema for deep storage handling, the reel feeding into the ledger with instructions that turned discovery into workflow: report, contain, harvest, assign. There was a new flag beside the phrase that had haunted the files for a century, now lighting a different column. The stamp fell with habitual pressure, and the desk trembled as the cycle began anew, an echo of hope, tamed and measured, made to serve the perpetual engine of managed suffering. The nightmare in the tunnels had been neither accident nor aberration. It was the proof and the lesson that even hope, once identified, could be harvested, rationed, and turned to compliance. The system endured, not by erasing nightmares, but by learning to digest them, ensuring that every future promise of betterment would be recognized, contained, and repurposed, so that the music of salvation would always end in the hush of regulated silence. The stylus moved across parchment with mechanical precision, each stroke a small death made administrative. Administratum Clork Vex 9 hunched over his cogitator terminal, in the dim amber glow of Sub-Office 847-Delta, transferring names from categories that had evolved beyond their original meaning. The morning ritual began 3 hours before dawn, as it always did, but the fields on his screen told a different story than they had months before. Resource expended had been joined by threat neutralized, while active personnel now included subcategories for enhancement eligible and controlled application candidate. The system had learned to classify hope itself as a manageable resource. The ledger revealed patterns that demonstrated institutional evolution rather than mere administrative routine. Sub-level 847 maintained its familiar quarterly attrition rate of 3.2% among tunnel workers, but the consistency now represented sophisticated management rather than simple neglect. Workers showing signs of beneficial adaptation were no longer processed as casualties, but transferred to controlled application facilities, where their modifications could be exploited under strict supervision. The mathematics of acceptable loss had evolved into the arithmetic of strategic enhancement, with human potential harvested rather than merely consumed. Schedule Omega-7 routes dominated the morning's entries with familiar efficiency, but the routing protocols had acquired layers of meaning that transformed systematic disposal into systematic exploitation. Condemned sectors remained condemned, but the designation now indicated areas where beneficial change could be detected, contained, and harvested before it could spread beyond manageable parameters. Atmospheric monitoring equipment functioned with autonomous precision, triggering immediate quarantine protocols whenever readings suggested the presence of compounds that might improve rather than degrade human performance. The notation that had haunted maintenance records for over a century had finally been resolved. Deep store access, authorization pending, had been replaced throughout the system with authorization approved, accompanied by deployment schedules that suggested coordinated implementation across 17 different Hive cities. The sealed chambers were being opened not through accident or oversight, but through deliberate policy designed to manage beneficial discoveries as strategic assets rather than existential threats. Each entry carried resource allocation codes and harvesting quotas that demonstrated the system's capacity to digest even salvation itself. A courier arrived with a parcel that smelled faintly of incense and industrial solvent, containing a rubber stamp newly engraved with modified Imperial seals. The familiar gear consuming a human figure now included additional elements, measuring instruments, containment symbols, and the motto, efficiency through management, replacing the previous efficiency through expenditure. The change was subtle but significant, representing the system's evolution from simple consumption to sophisticated exploitation of human potential. Vex 9 tested the stamp on blotting paper, watching the impression emerge with crisp authority that made theoretical concepts feel concrete and inevitable. New classification codes appeared with increasing frequency. Beneficial anomaly containment, strategic enhancement deployment, population optimization protocol. Workers whose productivity exceeded baseline human norms were documented not as anomalies requiring investigation, but as successful implementations of controlled enhancement programs. The humming that had once emerged spontaneously from modified larynxes was now suppressed through counter-harmonic generators that thrummed with patient denial, their frequencies calibrated to prevent the dangerous 41.3 cycle resonance while maintaining the fiction of environmental noise. The morning's processing revealed the scope of systematic implementation as reports arrived from controlled application facilities across multiple sectors. Enhanced workers demonstrated productivity increases of 28%, while remaining psychologically dependent on Imperial life support systems through carefully calibrated exposure protocols. Their enhanced capabilities were managed through biometric shackles and atmospheric controls that ensured beneficial change remained a privilege granted by Imperial authority, rather than an inherent human right. As Vex 9 completed the day's ledgers, he prepared reports for transmission using protocols refined through experience with beneficial anomalies. Atmospheric improvements were documented as environmental optimization under controlled conditions, while enhanced worker capabilities were classified as strategic human resource development. The language transformed solutions into assets while maintaining the fiction that Imperial control was necessary for their proper management. The morning ritual concluded with the familiar sound of the rubber stamp marking another day's successful conversion of human resources into statistical data. But the sound carried different meaning now. Not the percussion of simple disposal, but the rhythm of sophisticated harvesting, the mechanical heartbeat of a system that had learned to consume hope itself. Above the tunnels, the machine slept well, armed now with enhanced knowledge of how to identify, contain, and weaponize beneficial change before it could challenge the fundamental assumptions keeping the engine of controlled suffering functioning with mechanical precision. The stylus completed its work, and silence settled over Sub-Office 847-Delta like dust over ruins that had learned to rebuild themselves in more efficient configurations. In the tunnels below, new crews descended through familiar routes, their footsteps echoing with the patient rhythm of a machine that had evolved beyond mere consumption into sophisticated exploitation, ensuring that even salvation would serve the perpetual machinery of Imperial control.